Welcome back. Well, if an international force were to enter Gaza, it wouldn't be the first in the area. Israel's borders are already home to 3 international peacekeeping forces, 2 organised by the UN and 1 created independently. The UN Disengagement Observer Force monitors the Golan Heights, occupied by Israel in the 1967 war. It also supervises the implementation of the 1974 ceasefire there. UNIFIL, the United Nations interim force in Lebanon, patrols the Israeli-Lebanese border. It was created in 1978 to observe Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon. After last year's war between Hezbollah and Israel, the force now monitors the end of fighting in southern Lebanon. It also helps to ensure humanitarian access to civilians. And an independent international force, the Multinational Force and Observers, operates in the Sinai Peninsula and backs up the 1979 peace treaty signed by Israel and Egypt. Well, joining us again are our guests from Gaza, Mohamed Abu Sada, Professor of Political Sciences at Al-Azhar University, from Ramallah, Bassem Esbidi, Professor of Political Sciences at Birzeit University, and from Beirut, Timur Göksel, former Senior Advisor to UNIFIL. If I could start with you, Mr. Göksel, what would you say the record is in the area for UN missions?
There's another one UN mission that could be discussed, which we didn't discuss, just as a reference to that. It doesn't have to be a force that goes into Gaza. There is also another UN instrument called the Civilian Election Observers. Don't rule that out. That could be a compromise solution. Anyway, to go back to your question, UN forces in the Middle East have always provided, I think, exceptionally useful conflict management role. But when you expect them to solve your conflict as in a conflict resolution role, this is not what they are for. They can't do that. They don't have the capability, they don't have the diplomatic capacity for those things. But as a conflict management tool, it's an extremely useful tool, especially the force you mentioned on the Golan, UNDOF, the UN Disengagement Observer Force, is one of the best functioning UN missions in the world because it's been there under an accord brokered by Henry Kissinger, with total agreement of Syria and Israel. Everything is signed, sealed, and very, very carefully observed by both sides. So here you have a very, very small force, 1,200 men altogether, men and women, very lightly armed. You cannot even call them armed. They are doing a fantastic job because they have the full cooperation of the parties on both sides. Their jobs are defined, their mission is defined.
So do you think that's the only way to do it then? I mean, that you can only bring peacekeepers in once you have an agreement between the two sides, but the problem is that you haven't got an agreement between two sides, so how do you bring about peace? I suppose that's the chicken and egg business, isn't it?
I mean, in any peacekeeping mission, consent of the parties involved is the prerequisite. Without that, you cannot even move. I mean, then you get into trouble like the original UNIFIL that I served with for 24 years. You don't have a state authority. You don't have anybody to deal with. And then you let these UN soldiers with light arms and very limited privileges and prerogatives lose in an area where there is combat, uncontrolled combat. Then you cannot expect them to do anything. Then they become an expert in survival. Then the mission becomes risk aversion and protection of the troops. But if you want that force to do something, then you better have 2 defined sides.
Okay, if I could bring in Bassem Esbidi, having 2 defined sides, as Mr. Göksel was saying there, is pretty important. How do you think you could get to that point in the Palestinian territories?
I'm afraid this kind of logic does not really apply here in the occupied territories. These forces around us here in Palestine, Syria, Egypt, these forces are to enhance a sense of order. I mean, in the case of Egypt, to enhance peace, and in the case of Syria, it's a continuation of the ceasefire, awaiting for some kind of settlement to happen. So we are talking about 2 sovereign states. that are part of these deals. But here in Palestine, we do not really have such a thing. We have a situation where the entire order is controlled by the Israeli occupation, and for these troops, if they are ever to come, they will be perceived by almost everybody as intervening in the internal Palestinian circumstances, and they will have nothing to do with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
But
therefore,
isn't the problem here? Sorry to stop you there.
Let me
just stop you there. Isn't one of the problems there that you've got factions who are not united, and so when you talk about the Israeli side of it, there's also the problem within the Palestinian territories of the two factions fighting each other, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. That was exactly my point. In order to bring a sense of united leadership in Palestine, some kind of address, some kind of title where people can approach and they can have business with. We do need here in Palestine an internal initiative on our own, probably to be supported by some outside forces. But the initiative has to be internal, and the model has to be also Palestinian. Unless we approach it in this way, I'm afraid this very goal that we are aiming to achieve will never be achieved through bringing an international force, hoping that force will unite the Palestinians. In my view, it will deepen the division among the Palestinians, and it will basically deepen the rift between the West Bank and Gaza, and we will be awaiting for another round of probably much more bloody confrontation between both sides.
Okay, Muhammad Abu Sada, an internal initiative is what your colleague is recommending. Do you think that can work? And if people like Mr. Abbas is having to call for, or is making the call for international troops, why can't he initially look at something like an internal solution?
Well, the friction between Hamas and Fatah is not new in here in the Gaza Strip or in the Palestinian territories. Since Hamas won the Palestinian elections in early 2006, we have been witnessing a very big gap between Hamas and Fatah, and what is happening right now is a result of what happened 2 weeks ago when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip. But I believe that with regard to the deployment of international forces here in the Gaza Strip, the question that we should be asking is, what is the mandate of this international force? What is its responsibility? Whether this international force is going to separate between the Palestinian and Israelis and try to put an end to the Israeli occupation, I don't think any Palestinian group will reject or object to this such initiative. But if such a force is going to be deployed here in the Gaza Strip to disarm the Palestinian resistance groups and try to work for one faction over the other one, that's when we are going to see more friction and more deterioration here between Hamas and Fatah, or between Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. But I think, as I mentioned at the beginning of this program, before deploying any such forces here in the Palestinian territories, and especially in the Gaza Strip, what we need is a Palestinian dialogue between Hamas and Fatah, with the intervention of Arab League or the Arab countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, or Jordan, and not just call for dialogue. They should pressure Hamas and Fatah to go to the negotiating table and negotiate and reach an agreement over deploying such an international force, which could be a beginning for early presidential and parliamentary elections here in the Palestinian territories, which can be an exit to the stalemate right now.
Okay, Timur Göksel, talk there of the importance of the mandate. In your experience, presumably that is something that is crucial for any kind of peacekeeping operation. The mandate has to be clear, doesn't it?
Well, that has been what has been recommended by every single reform paper on the United Nations peacekeeping for the last 40 years. A clear-cut mandate with a clear objective and a mission. But sadly and unfortunately, this is not the case, because the United Nations members cannot agree. So they put together what they use the constructive ambiguity, a meaningless mandate with a lot of verbiage. At the end, the mission becomes impossible because you never understand what the mandate is. I'm afraid there is no other way the UN can even think of writing a mandate for such a force in Palestine and Gaza. I don't think that is really in the cards at all. Because look, number one, the UN will demand a clear authority that will be responsible for the well-being and the protection of these UN troops. That's requirement number one. I don't think, although I'm not very much qualified to discuss what's happening in Palestine, I don't think that condition exists today, that there is a solid authority that will provide the well-being of the UN force. Then, UN would like to have, definitely like to have, a full access, control over its access routes. Today, at the moment, the whole area is under, as other interlocutors are saying, are under Israeli control. They call the shots. They decide who enters the territories and Gaza. And UN will not be willing to put its troops in a position like this, where their logistics lines will be controlled by Israel.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop you there. Just very briefly, the other two gentlemen, in a word, do you think this is going to happen? If I could ask you first, Bassem Esbidi.
No, I do not think it's going to happen. I think it's one of those political maneuvers on the part of Mahmoud Abbas at this point. And if he looks really closely internally, he will learn and know and be very certain that it will have no chance to happen at all.
Okay, and just Mr. Abu Sada, just in a word, we've run out of time. Yes or no? Is this going to happen?
I agree with Dr. Bassem. I don't think it's going to happen, but I think it could happen with pressure from the United States and the international community to send such forces under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter.
Must stop you there. Thank you both. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thank you at home for watching this edition of Inside Story.